Hi Founder fans, Jason here, and today we're going to talk about Thomas Jefferson's difficult time selecting a Secretary of the Navy. Now on March 12th, 1801, he wrote a letter to James Madison, who was out of town because his father was ill, so he was back in Virginia waiting for his father to pass away, which is why he missed Jefferson's inauguration. Jefferson, obviously, James Madison was the easy choice for Jefferson as Secretary of State. And he writes him this letter, and he opens the letter by saying that Henry Dearborn has already been approved as Secretary of War, and Albert Gallatin was there offering advice, and he would soon thereafter become Secretary of the Treasury. And all three of those men would be part of Jefferson's administration for the entire time he's in office. But it's a little bit more difficult selecting a Secretary of the Navy. Now, Benjamin Stoddert, who was John Adams' Secretary of the Navy, said he would stay on for a few months while Jefferson found someone to replace him, because it was a new office. Stoddert was the first one to have the position. Washington didn't actually have a Secretary of the Navy, believe it or not. So Jefferson first, he's telling Madison what he tried to do, which first he approached Robert Livingston, Robert Livingston was Chancellor of New York for 25 years, throughout the Revolution, throughout the Washington and Adams administration. Chancellor was kind of like Chief Justice of the New York Supreme Court. Not exactly, because it's for a different type of court. Livingston and Jefferson would have known each other from the Second Continental Congress. When they wrote the Declaration of Independence, it was a committee of 5 selected. Jefferson, of course, Franklin and John Adams, famously, but also Roger Sherman from Connecticut, and Robert Livingston was on that committee, although he didn't really do much in the writing, and he would go back to New York before the signing, so his name's not on the document. But so these two gentlemen would have known each other a very long time. Robert Livingston said, "Thanks, but no thanks." It wasn't a total loss. Livingston later that year would go to France and represent Jefferson, where he would work with James Monroe and create the Louisiana Purchase. So, not a total loss. So Jefferson says, okay, I'll go ask Samuel Smith. Now, Samuel Smith was a general in the Maryland militia during the Revolution, and he was a Maryland politician who had, success in his state, but didn't do much on the national scene. Jefferson approached him, and he said no. So Jefferson then decided, okay, I'm going to go talk to John Langdon. Now, John Langdon was another revolutionary who served in the Continental Congress, and he was at the Constitutional Convention. He was a 2-time governor of New Hampshire, and he had been representing New Hampshire in the United States Senate since day one. As soon as Washington got there, he was immediately in the Senate and been there the entire time, and left the day Jefferson was inaugurated. So Jefferson said, hey, stay in Washington and be Secretary of the Navy. And Langdon went, nah, I'm good on that. I am going to go back home. And he would end up being governor 2 more times of New Hampshire. So Jefferson said, okay. And he asked, he talks to a Lear. He keeps using the name Lear. Now I assume this is Tobias Lear, who was a friend of Jefferson's and was George Washington's personal secretary for a huge portion of his life, and was the man there when Washington died. Lear would also go on to serve Jefferson's administration in the Caribbean and then in North Africa. And that's why I assume this is the Lear he's referencing, because he would use him anyway. But he seems kind of hesitant to use Lear. Tobias Lear was a younger person, and you can see he seems super hesitant. And he's like, maybe I'll have him do it for 6 months or so. But Jefferson says, I'm going to ask Samuel Smith again. Now, Samuel Smith doesn't get the job, or I would assume turns him down, because I was really only reading the one letter. But the person who does get the job is Samuel Smith's brother, Robert Smith. Not Robert Smith of the Cure, Robert Smith of the American Revolution. And Robert Smith, even though he was clearly not the first choice, he would go on to be, he would join Madison, Dearborn, and Gallatin, and be a member of the Jefferson administration for all 8 years. He would actually serve a little bit into Madison's administration and be Madison's Secretary of State for a while, although they ended up butting heads, but that's a different story for another time. The last thing I'd like to note about this letter is Jefferson is saddened. He acknowledges what a loss America has had because Robert Morris was in prison. And he says that this would be an easy decision if Robert Morris was still around. Robert Morris, who I've talked about several times, is one of the most important founders that we don't talk about anymore. Morris had helped finance the war. He was Secretary of Finance during the Revolution, and he was also Secretary of the Marine during the Revolution. So he had this experience not only as head of the Navy, but during an actual war head of the Navy. But Robert Morris, of course, made some poor investments later in life, trying to recoup the losses he had from the Revolution, because he spent so much of his own money on it. But because of certain land speculation failures, Morris had actually gone to debtor's prison and had to declare bankruptcy. So Jefferson, it's interesting that Jefferson acknowledges that and laments it, is the word I was looking for. So that was the difficult process of picking a Secretary of the Navy for Thomas Jefferson. If you have any questions or comments, or if there's any founder you think would have made a good Secretary of the Navy for Jefferson, leave a comment below. And as always, hit like and subscribe, and we will see you tomorrow.